Good evening and welcome back to Classified Conflict. Wherever you are right now, whether you are settling in for the night or letting the last of the day fall away, I'm glad you're here. Take a slow, quiet breath and let the world outside wait for a while. Tonight, we are traveling back into a chapter of history that sits at the intersection of engineering, military doctrine, and the very human cost of modern war. The subject is one of the most feared weapons ever fielded in ground combat, not because of how many existed, though hundreds of thousands were built, but because of what a single one could do and what it meant to be the man behind it. The weapon is the MG-42. The men are the machine gunners of the Second World War, German soldiers who carried this gun across every major front of the conflict, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Soviet Union, from the mountains of Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy. And the story of this weapon is not only a story about ballistics and rate of fire, it is a story about doctrine, identity, survival, and the weight that certain men carried long after the shooting stopped. Before we go any further, if this kind of unhurried, deeply researched historical narration is something you find yourself coming back to, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this content reach more people, and it genuinely matters. Now let's begin. To understand what it meant to be an MG-42 gunner in the Second World War, we need to go back further than 1942. We need to understand the weapon it replaced, why that replacement became urgent, and how a company with no firearms experience whatsoever ended up producing one of the most influential military weapons of the 20th century. When Germany launched its rearmament program in the 1930s under National Socialism, the German army had already arrived at a tactical philosophy that set it apart from its future adversaries. In Britain and America, infantry doctrine placed the individual rifleman at the center of the squad. Machine guns existed to support the riflemen, to provide cover as they advanced, to hold ground under pressure. The gun served the man with the rifle. Germany's military planners had reached a different conclusion, drawn from the lessons of the First World War, where the machine gun had proven to be the single most decisive infantry weapon on the battlefield. In the German model, the machine gun was the squad. The rifleman existed to serve it, protect it, and keep it fed. And that philosophical reversal, seemingly small in theory, would shape the entire character of German infantry combat for the next 6 years. In 1936, the German army adopted the MG-34, the Maschinengewehr 34, to embody this doctrine. It was, by every reasonable assessment, an exceptional weapon. It was air-cooled and recoil-operated, light enough for one man to carry yet capable of firing between 800 and 900 rounds per minute. It could be fitted with a bipod for mobile infantry use, or mounted on a heavy tripod called the lafette for long-range sustained fire. German soldiers respected it. Allied soldiers feared it. But the MG-34 carried within its excellence a fatal structural problem, and that problem had nothing to do with how it functioned in the field. The MG-34 required approximately 150 man-hours to manufacture. It was machined from high-grade steel alloys, its parts fitted and finished to precise tolerances. Every component reflected the standards of skilled craftwork. That level of quality was genuinely impressive, and it was becoming a crisis. Germany was fighting simultaneously in France, in North Africa, and on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front alone stretched for thousands of miles. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers needed machine guns. Every additional machine gun meant another 150 man-hours in factories already under pressure. The MG-34 could not be produced fast enough or cheaply enough to meet the scale of demand the war was generating. By February 1937, 4 years before America entered the conflict, the German army had already identified the problem clearly enough to act on it. 3 companies were invited to submit designs for a new machine gun, one built not around craft manufacturing, but around industrial speed. The requirement was direct: stamp and press the weapon from sheet steel rather than machine it from solid metal. Design something an unskilled factory worker could assemble, reduce cost, reduce labor, and do it without surrendering the performance that made the MG-34 effective. The three companies approached were Rheinmetall Borsig, Stübgen, and a firm called Metall- und Lackierwarenfabrik Johannes Grossfuß AG, based in Döbeln in the state of Saxony. Grossfuß was the most unusual candidate of the three. The company had no background in weapons manufacture of any kind. Their core business was pressed and stamped sheet metal products. Their most recognizable product was decorative metal lanterns. They had no firearms engineers, no military experience, and no existing contracts. What they had was a single engineering talent whose specialization happened to match the brief almost exactly. His name was Werner Gruner, and he was Grossfuß's leading design engineer. His expertise was industrial mass production using stamped and pressed steel, precisely what the German army was asking for. Gruner knew almost nothing about machine guns when the project was assigned to him, and his response to that gap was methodical rather than hesitant. He enrolled in an army machine gunners course, spent time in conversation with soldiers who had actually carried and operated the MG-34 in the field and gathered their observations about what worked and what didn't. He then took an existing operating mechanism originally developed by Mauser, began building around it, and applied the logic of industrial manufacturing to every decision. The design that resulted kept its exterior geometry deliberately close to the MG-34. The Lafette tripod, the optical sight mountings, the belt drums, and other accessories already in service could all be used without modification. But the construction underneath was categorically different. Where the MG-34 had been precision machined, Gruner's design was built from pressed and stamped carbon steel sheet, joined by spot welding and riveting. Only the components subjected to the most intense mechanical stress, the bolt, the barrel, the locking surfaces, were milled from solid steel. Everything else was formed quickly and cheaply in a press. The result required 75 man-hours to build, against the MG-34's 150. It used 27.5 kilograms of raw material against the MG-34's 49 kilograms, and it cost 250 Reichsmarks to produce, against the MG-34's 327, a reduction of nearly a quarter in materials, half the labor, and a quarter less in cost, all delivered in the same general-purpose package. Gruner submitted his entry in October 1937. The Army requested refinements in April 1938, and further prototype development continued through 1939. The weapon was formally adopted in 1942, and it was designated the Maschinengewehr 42, the MG-42. The 42 was simply the year of its service adoption, but within months of reaching the front lines, that designation would acquire a weight that had nothing to do with the calendar. The MG-42 was 48 inches long in its standard configuration, with a barrel of about 22 inches. It weighed approximately 25 pounds, lighter than most people imagine when they consider what it was capable of. A single soldier could carry it at pace with an advancing unit. A single soldier could deploy it from a carry position and begin firing within seconds. It could be fed from a 50-round flexible metal belt, a 75-round saddle drum, or from multiple belts linked together for extended engagements. Its effective range against individual targets extended to around 1,100 yards. When properly mounted on the Lafette 42 tripod with the optical sight fitted, some accounts record effective suppressive fire at ranges approaching 2,300 yards. The Lafette tripod itself, a large and adjustable mounting with integral traversing controls, weighed around 45 pounds and incorporated a telescopic sight that permitted the gun to engage targets at long range with a degree of precision that approached what an artillery crew would recognize. But the specifications, the weight, the caliber, the effective range, are not what soldiers remembered when they described this weapon. What they remembered, on both sides of the battle line, was the sound. And the sound is where the MG-42 diverged most completely from every other automatic weapon on the Second World War battlefield. Most machine guns of that era fired at rates between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. The American Browning M1919 cycled at around that range. The British Bren gun operated at approximately 500 rounds per minute. Even the MG-34, already considered an unusually fast weapon when it entered service, managed between 800 and 900 rounds per minute. All of these weapons shared a basic acoustic character, a rapid staccato that the human ear could follow as a sequence of individual shots, even at high rates of fire. The MG-42 operated at between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, with some bolt and spring combinations pushing higher still. At those rates, 20 or more rounds discharged every single second, the individual reports of each shot merged together entirely. The human ear could no longer separate them. What reached the ear instead was a single continuous tearing sound, a sustained mechanical rip unlike anything else on the battlefield. American soldiers who encountered it called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the way it cut through formations of men. Soviet troops, who absorbed enormous casualties from it on the Eastern Front, called it the linoleum ripper, a name that captured the physical character of the sound with unsettling accuracy. British soldiers often referred to it as the Spandau, a generic name they had applied to German machine guns since the First World War. Among German soldiers themselves, it went by several names: Hitlersäge, Hitler's saw, Knochensäge, bone saw, Schneller Spritzer, fast sprayer, and Elektrisches MG, the electric machine gun, because it sounded more like machinery than like gunfire. Brazilian soldiers of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force fighting in Italy gave it an entirely different name, Lourdinha. One soldier said the sound of the weapon reminded him of his fiancée's sewing machine back home in Brazil. Her name was Maria de Lourdes. That last detail is worth holding. Embedded inside one of the most destructive weapons in the history of infantry combat was a sound that a young man from the other side of the Atlantic associated with a woman at a sewing machine. And that says something about how completely this weapon threaded itself into the memory and the lives of everyone who came near it. Not just as an object of fear, but as an experience that people carried in their bodies long after the war ended. The tactical significance of the sound was not accidental. A target crossing open ground in front of a machine gun position was exposed for only a few seconds before reaching cover or concealment. Against a weapon firing at 450 rounds per minute, a fast-moving soldier had a reasonable chance of crossing that exposure window between bursts or while the gunner was adjusting aim. Against a weapon firing at 1,500 rounds per minute, the statistical reality changed dramatically. The density of fire in any given window of time was so much greater that the margin for a crossing soldier collapsed towards zero. And beyond individual targets, the high cyclic rate gave the MG-42 specific advantages against aircraft, against vehicles crossing exposed terrain, and against any target that minimized its exposure time by moving quickly. More rounds in the air per second meant less time for anything to pass through unscathed. That advantage came with a direct cost, and both the weapons designers and the soldiers who used it understood this without ambiguity. A 50-round ammunition belt would be emptied in roughly 2.5 seconds at the MG-42's maximum cyclic rate. A 75-round drum lasted perhaps 3.5 seconds. The weapon consumed ammunition at a pace that would seem almost reckless by the standards of other infantry weapons. Managing that consumption, controlling burst length, conserving belts, coordinating resupply, was one of the central operational challenges of operating the gun. And it was the primary reason the German army rebuilt its entire infantry squad structure around the gun's needs, rather than treating the gun as a supplementary asset. The MG-42 in its ideal configuration was served by 6 men, and the precise role of each man within that crew tells us something important about what it actually meant to operate this weapon in combat. The first man was the squad leader, a junior non-commissioned officer who commanded the team, directed its fire, made the tactical decisions about when to engage, when to hold, and when to relocate. He carried a pistol as his personal weapon because his primary function was command, not combat. In the Wehrmacht's infantry structure, the machine gun team's NCO occupied a position of real authority because the gun was the squad's primary reason for existing and his judgment governed how it was used. The second man was the gunner himself, the Schütze one, or first soldier. He lay behind the weapon, aimed it, pressed the trigger, and managed it through its firing cycles. His personal weapon was a pistol, because his real weapon was the MG-42. The demands of the role were specific and not easily acquired. He had to control the gun's recoil, maintain a useful aim despite the vibration of a weapon firing more than 1,000 rounds per minute, and regulate the duration of each burst to avoid consuming ammunition too quickly or overheating the barrel too fast. The MG-42 had no single-shot mode. It was capable only of fully automatic fire, so all rate management fell to the gunner's trigger discipline. For an inexperienced operator, this was genuinely difficult. The recoil was substantial, the vibration disruptive, and at the weapon's cyclic speed, even a brief trigger press sent a dozen or more rounds downrange. Training that discipline into a gunner took real time and repetition. The third man was the assistant gunner and loader. He kept the ammunition belt feeding cleanly into the receiver, watched for mechanical failures, and, most critically, performed the barrel change when the barrel overheated. That last task was the most dangerous operational procedure in the MG-42's maintenance cycle, and it demanded speed and steadiness under conditions that were rarely calm. He carried a pistol as his personal weapon. The fourth man carried the Lafette 42 tripod, the heavy adjustable mount that transformed the weapon into a sustained fire platform. The Lafette weighed approximately 45 pounds on its own. The man hauling it through a combat environment was often exposed and burdened, so he was armed with an MP-40 submachine gun for close-range personal defense, rather than a rifle that would have required a free hand to operate effectively. The fifth and sixth men were ammunition carriers and general support. Between them and the rest of the squad, the standard load was 1,800 rounds, distributed across the crew and supplemented where possible from company stocks. They also carried spare barrels, entrenching tools, and cleaning materials. They were armed with carabiner 98K bolt-action rifles, and their most important function, beyond fighting, was keeping the gun supplied and the position prepared. When the gun moved, they moved. When the gun fired, they were already preparing the next belt, the next barrel, the next position. By the later stages of the war, as casualties mounted and replacement rates failed to keep pace, this six-man ideal was rarely realized. Gun teams were reduced to 3 men, sometimes 2, sometimes the crew was simply whoever had survived. The consequences were direct and practical. The position was harder to defend with fewer rifles, ammunition resupply became precarious, and the burden on the remaining crew members compounded with every reduction in number. The task of barrel changing, already dangerous under the best conditions, became substantially more so when the crew had no one to spare. The barrel change was the single most consequential operational procedure in the MG-42's field maintenance cycle, and it shaped everything about how the weapon was used and how the enemy tried to fight it. The physics were straightforward. A weapon cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute generated heat at a rate that no fixed barrel could sustain indefinitely. The MG-42's barrel was designed from the beginning to be replaced rapidly, within seconds, using a procedure the assistant gunner was trained to execute under fire. The swing-out lever on the right side of the barrel housing was released. The hot barrel was withdrawn using an insulated glove, a cool replacement was inserted, and the lever was locked closed. With a practiced, well-drilled crew operating under controlled conditions, this could be completed in under 10 seconds. Accounts from veterans describe experienced crews completing the exchange in as few as 6 seconds. Machine gun teams carried up to 6 spare barrels during sustained engagements, rotating through them as each reached its thermal limit, generally after around 200 to 250 rounds of continuous fire. Allied forces were trained directly around this vulnerability. American and British infantry manuals and training films instructed soldiers to listen for the lull in MG-42 fire that signaled a barrel change, to expect that silence to last 8 to 10 seconds, and to use those seconds to advance. The reasoning was tactically sound in principle. 10 seconds of movement could close meaningful ground and potentially bring attackers within grenade range of the gun position before the next barrel was locked and ready. But the training film's advice had a serious gap that veterans recognized immediately. The gun was never alone. The riflemen surrounding the MG-42 position continued firing throughout any barrel change. The crew carried pistols. The position itself was usually fortified, behind earthworks, inside a bunker, dug into a hillside. A frontal assault on an MG-42 position in the 10 seconds of a barrel change remained, in the assessment of soldiers who had survived one attempted, effectively suicidal. The US Army produced a training film specifically to address the psychological effect the MG-42's sound had on newly arrived replacements, assuring its audience that the German gun's high rate of fire came at the expense of accuracy and that American weapons were more efficient. Veterans of the European theater were generally unpersuaded. The film's narrator told his audience that the German gun's bark was worse than its bite. Soldiers who had spent time in the hedgerows of Normandy or the mountains of Italy did not find this reassuring. The MG-42 first reached the front lines in 1942 during the North Africa campaign, where German and Italian forces were fighting the British 8th Army across the desert terrain of Libya and Egypt. The environment presented specific challenges that had already compromised the MG-34 significantly. Desert sand was relentless, fine-grained, and omnipresent. It penetrated mechanism covers, abraded moving surfaces, and clogged the tightly toleranced components of precision-machined weapons. The MG-34 had notoriously poor tolerance for dirt and particulate matter under field conditions. The MG-42, built from pressed steel with looser manufacturing tolerances, handled the environment substantially better. Soldiers who had watched the MG-34 jam in conditions that shut it down found the new weapon more forgiving, more willing to continue functioning when dirty or imperfectly cleaned. The Desert War was also a war of rapid movement and shifting front lines, and the gun's portability, the fact that one man could carry it and deploy it within seconds, made it particularly suited to a mobile campaign where heavy support weapons often fell behind the pace of operations. The desert campaigns, however, were limited in scope compared to what followed. The Eastern Front, the Soviet-German theater, was the war at its most extreme, in virtually every dimension, and it was there that the MG-42 found the conditions that most tested both its design and the men who operated it. The Eastern Front extended from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Black Sea in the south, a continuous line of combat roughly equivalent in length to the entire continental United States measured coast to coast. The seasonal range was severe. Russian winters regularly dropped to -30 and -40 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, bare skin contacting metal caused instant frostbite. Lubricants froze solid, bolts locked in their housings, springs lost tension. Operating any mechanical system in those conditions required specific design adaptations, and the MG-42 incorporated them deliberately. The cocking handle and the catch for the top cover, both mechanisms that needed to be operated quickly under fire, were sized and shaped so that a soldier wearing heavy Arctic mittens could manipulate them without removing gloves. Alternatively, a stick or rod could engage these mechanisms if mittens made direct manipulation impossible. The MG-34 had not been designed with this consideration. The MG-42 was, because by the time it reached the drawing board, the German army had already experienced a winter on the Eastern Front and had learned what that oversight cost. The tactical environment on the Eastern Front introduced a different order of challenge. Soviet military doctrine in the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 1942, and in the large-scale offensive operations from 1943 onward, frequently employed mass infantry assaults, formations of soldiers advancing together and accepting catastrophic losses in the expectation that sheer numbers would eventually overrun a defensive position. For an MG-42 crew holding a section of the line, a Soviet human wave attack meant the gun was firing almost continuously. The ammunition supply was evaporating at the weapon's full cyclic rate. The barrels were being changed under fire at the fastest possible pace, and the waves continued arriving. The ammunition problem this created was not marginal. In extended engagements against mass assaults, MG-42 crews regularly exhausted their supply before the attack was fully defeated. And when the ammunition ran out, the weapon's exceptional firepower simply ceased to exist. The crew had pistols and whatever rifles the support soldiers carried, and nothing more. One account from soldiers who served on the Eastern Front described the tactic of holding fire until an advancing Soviet formation had closed to within roughly 50 meters before opening up, allowing the attackers to come close precisely because at that range, with a weapon firing at the MG-42's cyclic rate, the effect was maximized before the formation could reach the position. Waiting in a foxhole while a mass assault drew to 50 meters was a test of discipline and nerve that is difficult to evaluate outside the experience itself. A separate account from an NCO who had served with both the MG-34 and the MG-42 described the practical difference between the two weapons in these engagements in stark terms. When traversing fire across a charging formation with the MG-34, he said, "The gun might hit every second man. The rate of fire left intervals in the sweep. With the MG-42, he said, it hit everyone." That single observation captures the weapon's tactical meaning more precisely than any specification table. The men who operated the gun were overwhelmingly young. Many were teenagers or barely past 20 when they found themselves lying behind the weapon in a forward position. They had been farmers, apprentices, students, and tradesmen. They had been conscripted by a state conducting a war of unprecedented scale, trained to operate a specific instrument of suppressive fire, and assigned to positions where their survival and the survival of everyone around them depended on how well they performed that role. Training for the position was intensive and detailed. A machine gunner was not instructed to point the weapon and hold the trigger. He was trained to disassemble and reassemble the MG-42 in darkness, to perform a barrel change under time pressure, to identify and clear mechanical failures under stress, and to fire in short, controlled bursts with a weapon that offered no single-shot mode and produced substantial recoil. He was trained on effective ranges, on leading moving targets, on selecting and preparing firing positions with attention to field of fire, cover, and access to alternate positions. And above all, he was trained to understand himself not as a rifleman with a heavier weapon, but as the central element of his squad's combat capability, the point around which everything else organized. The psychological weight that came with that identity was substantial, and it ran in two directions. On one side, the gunner understood his own importance. The Wehrmacht reinforced this actively. The gun was the squad's primary reason for existing. The riflemen were there to protect it. That knowledge carried a certain authority, even a certain pride. And on the other side, that same centrality made the gunner the most targeted individual on the German side of any engagement. Allied soldiers understood clearly that the MG-42 was the most dangerous element in a German defensive position. Neutralizing it was the first requirement for any advance, and they directed their resources accordingly. artillery observers directing fire onto German positions prioritized machine gun nests above almost everything else. Snipers, when they could identify an MG-42 crew, targeted the gunner or the loader first, specifically before engaging the riflemen around them. Mortar teams ranged on the muzzle flash. Infantry who managed to approach close enough threw grenades at the gun position as their first act, not at the riflemen. The MG-42 crew lived under a particular kind of threat. Not the diffuse danger of being somewhere dangerous, but the targeted danger of being the specific thing the enemy most needed to destroy. German doctrine addressed this through the concept of Stellungswechsel, position change, which was one of the most operationally important principles governing MG-42 deployment. The reasoning behind Stellungswechsel was direct. A machine gun that fires from the same position for too long will eventually be located and destroyed. The solution was constant, deliberate, unpredictable relocation. Standard doctrine called for 3 prepared positions: a primary position covering the expected avenue of enemy approach, a flanking position supporting adjacent units, and a concealed reserve position, called the Schweiger MG or ambush position, situated approximately 50 yards behind the main line to be occupied when the gun needed to withdraw under pressure. When the squad leader judged that the current position had been identified by the enemy, the team moved. The riflemen covered the displacement. The gun team, and the gun could be carried at a run by one man, moved rapidly to the next prepared site. When the position was established, the riflemen dug in around it and watched for the enemy while the gun set up. This required coordination, repetition, and trust among the crew members, qualities that became increasingly difficult to maintain as crew sizes shrank and replacements arrived with less and less time in training. In the attack, the gun's portability became a direct operational asset. The MG-42 could advance with the infantry, deploying and firing in support of a forward movement, then picking up and advancing again as the attack progressed. In offensive operations, multiple MG-42 positions were sited to support each other. When one gun relocated or changed a barrel, adjacent guns maintained fire, so the suppression of the enemy position never fully lifted. The entire German approach to infantry combat in the Second World War was built on this principle: layered, overlapping machine gun fire as the constant, and everything else organized in support of it. On June 6, 1944, that approach met the largest amphibious invasion in military history, and the outcome at one particular position on the Normandy coast has been studied and debated ever since. The beach, designated Omaha by Allied planners, extended for 5 miles between the village of Vierville-sur-Mer and the Colville Draw. Along the bluffs above it, the German army had constructed a series of fortified positions, Widerstandsnester or resistance nests, numbered and distributed to provide overlapping fields of fire across the sand below. The strongest of these was Widerstandsnest 62, positioned at the eastern side of the beach with commanding fields of fire across both the Easy Red and Fox Green sectors. WN-62 contained 75mm artillery pieces, 50mm anti-tank guns, mortars, MG-34 anti-aircraft mountings, and standard MG-42 infantry positions. It was manned by 40 soldiers, 27 from the 716th Static Infantry Division and 13 from the 352nd Infantry Division, a more capable and experienced formation. Among those 40 soldiers was a 20-year-old private named Heinrich Severloh. He had grown up on a farm in a village called Metzingen in the Lüneburg Heath area of Lower Saxony. He had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1941 at the age of 18. He had trained as a dispatch rider, served in the rear areas of his division on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1942, been punished for making dissenting remarks, spent several months in a military hospital, and by late 1943 had been assigned to the 352nd Infantry Division and sent to Normandy. His role at WN-62 was to serve as an orderly to Lieutenant Friedrich Fröking, whose primary duty was to direct the fire of artillery batteries positioned several kilometers inland. On the evening of June 5th, Severloh was sleeping in a French farmhouse a few kilometers from the coast when Fröking woke him. They drove to WN-62 in darkness, arriving shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. Fröking went to his observation post to begin coordinating artillery. An ammunition sergeant helped Severloh load his MG-42. Beyond the bluffs, the channel was invisible in the dark. Then, as light came slowly and grey through the channel weather, Severloh could see that the horizon was covered with ships. More ships than he had thought it possible to see gathered in one place. Thousands of vessels of every size, extending in every direction. At 6:30 in the morning, H hour, the first wave of landing craft ground onto the beach directly below WN-62. The ramps dropped. Soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment stepped out into the water and began moving toward the sand. Severloh opened fire. What followed was 9 hours of nearly continuous engagement. Over the course of that morning and into the afternoon, Severloh worked through approximately 13,500 rounds of belted MG-42 ammunition, plus roughly 400 additional rounds from 2 Carabiner 98K rifles when the machine gun was stopped for barrel changes or ammunition reloads. A sergeant remained at the position with him throughout, shuttling ammunition from the nearby storage bunker. The gun overheated repeatedly. Barrels were changed under fire. The work was mechanical, physical, and unrelenting. After the war, Severloh wrote a memoir about his experience at WN-62. In it, he described watching a Higgins boat, a flat-bottomed landing craft carrying approximately 30 soldiers, approach his position directly. When the ramp dropped and the soldiers began stepping out, he opened fire with the MG-42. He said it took approximately 3 seconds of fire, roughly 60 rounds, to stop the boat's load of soldiers. He described the water around the landing craft turning red. He also described hearing an American officer's voice over a loudspeaker, shouting in what he characterized as a hysterical tone as the men around the officer fell. Severloh withdrew from WN-62 at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon when the ammunition was exhausted and American soldiers had begun flanking the position. He was captured the following day near Colleville-sur-Mer. In 2004, Severloh was interviewed about his experience. He was asked how many men he had killed on that beach. His answer was this: "It was definitely at least 1,000 men, most likely more than 2,000. But I do not know how many men I shot. It was awful. Thinking about it makes me want to throw up." That figure requires context. Historians regard Severloh's claimed casualty numbers with substantial skepticism, and the skepticism is well-founded. Total Allied casualties across the entire 5-mile length of Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, killed, wounded, and missing combined, are estimated at approximately 2,400. For a single gunner at a single position to have inflicted more than half of those total casualties, or potentially more than all of them, contradicts what the casualty records suggest is plausible. The numbers Severloh cited were drawn from his own memory, offered more than 50 years after the event, without independent verification. What the historical record confirms is the following. Severloh was at WN-62. He operated an MG-42 for 9 hours against one of the largest amphibious operations ever mounted. His position commanded a particularly lethal section of beach. American soldiers landing there suffered catastrophic losses. And after the war, Severloh spent decades trying to account for what he had done and to find the men on the other side. He read American veterans' accounts. He tracked down a military chaplain named David Silver, who had been wounded by 3 bullets to the chest while landing on Omaha Beach. Severloh found Silver's name in Cornelius Ryan's account of D-Day, the longest day, and made contact. They met in person more than once, in Germany and in Normandy, and by accounts from those who knew them, they maintained a genuine friendship. Severloh died in January 2006 in a village near Metzingen at the age of 82. His memoir and the story of his post-war search for the men he had fought against remain among the more documented personal accounts of what the MG-42's operation looked like from the inside. The gun was not confined to Normandy. The campaigns at Monte Cassino and along the Gothic Line in Italy became some of the most attritional fighting in the Western theatre, and the MG-42 defined the character of German defensive positions throughout those months. The mountain terrain, narrow valleys, exposed ridgelines, terrain that channeled attackers into predictable routes, was well suited to a weapon that rewarded careful positioning and long fields of fire. Polish, American, and British soldiers who fought their way up the Italian peninsula came to know the weapon's sound with an intimacy born of extended, grinding exposure. In France and the Low Countries during the liberation of Western Europe, the weapon's density in German defensive formations was striking. By the autumn of 1944, German infantry companies were fielding one MG-42 per 10-man squad. A standard German infantry company of 150 men might contain 15 of the weapons, compared to the 2 light machine guns typically assigned to an American company of similar size. That ratio, 1 gun per squad versus 2 per company, reflected the fundamental difference in how the 2 armies organized their firepower. The German squad existed to serve the gun. The American squad was built around its riflemen, with the machine gun in a supporting role. In a straight exchange of firepower volume at the squad level, the German approach generated a density of automatic fire that a numerically larger American unit struggled to match in direct engagement. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, amplified this advantage significantly. The ancient field boundaries of the Norman countryside, tall earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, enclosing small fields and connecting them with sunken lanes, provided natural defensive positions at almost every turn. An MG-42 position behind a hedgerow with a clear field of fire along a lane or across an open field could halt an entire company in its tracks. Allied commanders in Normandy found the bocage campaign costly and slow, and the density of MG-42 positions in the hedgerows was a principal reason for both. Through the fighting in France and into Germany during the final months of the war, the material conditions of MG-42 crews deteriorated steadily. The German army was retreating and losing ground faster than it could replace equipment or personnel. The 6-man ideal crew was increasingly a historical artifact. 3 men was common. 2 was not unusual. Ammunition supply, already a chronic concern throughout the war, became erratic as Allied strategic bombing disrupted German production and transportation infrastructure. The careful Stellungswechsel, the disciplined movement between prepared positions, frequently gave way to improvised repositioning under fire to whatever cover the terrain offered, wherever the gun could be set up quickly. The doctrine remained sound, but the resources to execute it were gone. And yet, in these degraded conditions, the weapon continued to function. It operated in mud and snow. It operated dirty. It operated when crewed by young soldiers who had received only abbreviated training because its design had been deliberately structured to minimize the expertise required of its operators. The American Army, having encountered the weapon across North Africa and into Italy, made a direct attempt to replicate it in 1943. The Saginaw Steering Gear Company undertook the project, which was designated the T-24 machine gun. The T-24 was designed to fire the American .30-06 cartridge rather than the German 7.92 Mauser round, and the required modifications degraded its performance below the standard set by the weapon it was intended to copy. The project was abandoned, and the war ended before any American equivalent was fielded. Soviet military engineers who recovered intact MG-42s at the end of the war had more success. The technical drawings were taken to the Soviet Union, and elements of the design influenced subsequent Eastern Bloc weapons development in ways that military historians have documented in detail. The weapon's direct legacy in the Western world is more clearly traced through the nations that rebuilt their armed forces after 1945. When West Germany entered NATO in the 1950s and began reconstituting the Bundeswehr, the MG-42 was the natural starting point for its new general-purpose machine gun. The West German version, rechambered to fire the NATO standard 7.62mm cartridge, was designated the MG-1 and later refined into the MG-3. It entered service in 1959 and has since been used by more than 40 countries. As of the early 2020s, the MG-3 remained in service with the German Bundeswehr before being phased out in favor of newer designs. The external form is nearly indistinguishable from the wartime original. The operating principles are the same. The cyclic rate is similar. The sound, by all accounts, retains something of the character that earned the original its name. In the United States, the influence took a different form. The American M60 machine gun, which entered service in the late 1950s and served as the standard general-purpose machine gun in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and numerous other conflicts, incorporated the MG-42's belt feed mechanism as a direct design element. The M60 was the weapon American soldiers carried into conflicts for decades after the Second World War, and part of its operating mechanism was descended directly from the weapon their fathers and grandfathers had been trained to fear. The Belgian FN-MAG, one of the most widely deployed machine guns in the world today, used a trigger mechanism that is essentially a copy of the MG-42's. The Swiss MG-51, the Spanish Setmi Amelie, and the Austrian MG-74 all carry design elements traceable to the same stamped steel original produced by Werner Gruner's team at the Grossfuss factory in Döbeln. Production during the war years reflected how thoroughly Germany committed to the weapon once it entered service. In 1942, approximately 17,900 MG-42s were produced. In 1943, that number climbed to over 116,700. In 1944, it peaked at more than 211,800. Even in the final months of 1945, as the Reich's industrial base was collapsing under Allied bombing and advancing armies, over 61,800 were completed before production ceased entirely. 5 manufacturing companies contributed to this output: Grossfuss in Döbeln, Gustloff-Werke in Suhl, Mauser in Borsigwald, Steyr in Vienna, and Marget in Berlin, producing an average of more than 100 guns per day from 1942 through 1945. Total wartime production exceeded 400,000 units. Each of those guns required a crew. Each crew was composed of men drawn from farms and cities and small towns across Germany and the occupied territories. Each of those men carried the gun through engagements in which their survival and the survival of those around them depended on what they did. The psychological dimension of that role is not often addressed in histories of the weapon, which generally focus on specifications and doctrine. But it was consequential. The gunner was the center point of every action his squad undertook. When the gun fired, the entire squad organized itself around the gun's requirements. When the gun stopped, for a barrel change, for a reload, for a malfunction, the tactical situation changed immediately and dangerously for everyone in the position. The gunner understood that the firepower he controlled was the most important asset his unit possessed, and that his ability to maintain it was what stood between the squad and the consequences of losing that advantage. That was not a small thing to carry into a forward position. Former machine gunners from both sides of the conflict, men who had fired the MG-42 and men who had been on the receiving end of it, almost universally described the sensory experience of the weapon as one that stayed with them permanently. The mechanical sound of its fire, the heat rising from the barrel, the continuous feed of the belt, the physical vibration of the operating mechanism. These are not abstractions. They are physical memories that soldiers reported carrying into old age, returning in quiet moments, present in ways that other memories of the war were not. The US Army's response to the MG-42's psychological effect on its own soldiers is in itself a measure of how seriously that effect was taken. The War Department, responding to reports that newly arrived replacements were being effectively immobilized by fear at the sound of the gun, produced a training film designed to address the problem before soldiers entered combat. The film showed American and German automatic weapons in a side-by-side comparison, and a narrator explained calmly that while the German gun had a higher cyclic rate, this did not make it a superior weapon. American weapons, the narrator maintained, offered greater accuracy. The German gun was loud, but the narrator assured his audience that its bark was worse than its bite. Veterans of the Italian campaign and the Normandy campaign were not, by general report, persuaded. The film had to be made at all because the fear was real enough to affect combat performance. That is the measure of what the weapon had become in the minds of the men who faced it. The MG-42 was not designed by a weapons engineer. It was not designed by anyone with firearms expertise or a military background. It was designed by an industrial engineer who specialized in pressing and stamping sheet metal into decorative objects, who had never touched a machine gun before he was assigned to this project, and who responded to that gap by going directly to the soldiers who had used the weapon it was meant to replace and asking them what they needed. Werner Gruner's name appears in almost none of the popular histories of the Second World War. He is absent from most general accounts of the conflict, and the weapon he produced, built from sheet metal stampings and spot welds and drawn from conversations with junior infantrymen, became one of the most studied and most replicated small arms in the history of organized warfare. The men who served that weapon, in the six-man configurations of the war's early years, in the reduced crews of 3 and 2 in its later stages, and sometimes as one exhausted soldier keeping the gun firing through a retreating action, lived afterward in the knowledge of what they had done with it. Some, like Heinrich Severloh, pursued that knowledge actively, seeking out the men they had fought against and sitting with them in the decades after the war ended. Others carried it privately, without discussion, in the way that a large portion of that generation chose to carry what the war had made of them. The guns themselves survive in museums. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans holds one, recovered from a field in Belgium by an American truck driver who spotted it abandoned after an engagement, couldn't disassemble it for transport, and eventually had a German prisoner of war show him how. The NRA National Firearms Museum in Virginia holds another. The Bundeswehr's military history collections in Germany preserve examples alongside the MG-3 variants that served in uniform for half a century after the war. The weapon is a historical artifact now, a precision object under glass, photographed and catalogued and studied by historians and engineers. But within living memory of some of the oldest veterans still alive, it was a sound that stopped men in their tracks. It was a mechanical sensation, felt through the hands and the arms of a young man lying in a forward position, responsible for the most important piece of equipment his unit possessed, targeted specifically and continuously by every weapon the enemy could bring to bear. It was the sound that a Brazilian soldier associated with a woman at a sewing machine. It was the sound Heinrich Severloh heard for 9 hours on a June morning, and that he could not stop hearing for the rest of his life. History is not only made in the decisions of generals or the movements of armies. Sometimes it turns on the specific capabilities of a specific instrument, on the rate at which a bolt cycles, on the speed of a barrel change, on the acoustic character of a mechanical action at maximum cyclic rate. And sometimes it lives in the quiet that follows, in the decades of an ordinary life shaped around what one morning on a clifftop in Normandy cost a man to carry. The MG-42 gunners of the Second World War are mostly gone now. The records remain, the memoirs, the technical manuals, the oral histories, the accounts from both sides of the same engagements. We return to those records not to valorize what happened, but to understand it clearly, because understanding it is the only honest way to hold it. And so tonight, as the world grows still around you, remember that the history of any conflict is finally a history of specific people in specific positions, doing specific things with the tools their governments gave them. The statistics belong to the historians. The experience belonged to the men. And what they made of that experience in the long years of ordinary life that followed the extraordinary years of war is as much a part of the record as any specification table or battle report. Rest well. The world will be waiting when you wake, waiting when you wake, waiting when you wake, waiting when you wake, waiting.